Hello everyone, my name is Eric. I'm a limited licensed master social worker and psychotherapist. I've been working with children, youth, and adults for 10 years. On today's episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? We're going to be discussing what I consider to be one of the most important books on mythology and contemporary society. An interesting thing about this book is that it comes not from one of the famous Jungians, but from one of my favorite modern existential psychotherapists, Rollo. The cry for myth leaves out all of the talk of archetypes and in-depth history and development of symbolism, and focuses more on the importance of creating and finding the myths that we live by in our everyday lives. One of the most fulfilling things about being a psychotherapist is knowing that I get to meet people who are all at very critical moments of their lives. There's hardly a person I meet which is not at their subjective rock bottom when they begin psychotherapy. It is usually the loneliest, most painful, but deeply meaningful part of their myth, but it is from the mud from which the lotus flower unfolds into all of its beauty. Therapy may not be the beginning of their myth, it never is, but it can be considered a new beginning, or hopefully the point from which their myth turns from tragedy to triumph. Ultimately, and usually unconsciously, we enact our own personal mythology every day through the way we live and respond to life. Rollo writes, myth-making is essential in gaining mental health, and the compassionate therapist will not discourage it. Indeed, the very birth and proliferation of psychotherapy in our contemporary age were called forth by the disintegration of our myths. We may take the rationalistic psychiatrist's behavior as an allegory for our modern age, when we in the 20th, now 21st century, are so concerned about proving that our technical reason is right and we wipe away in one fell swoop the silliness of myths. We also rob our own souls and threaten to destroy our society as part of the same deterioration. As long as the highest goal remains making money, as long as we teach practically no ethics by example in home or in government, as long as these young people are not inspired to form a philosophy of life, and as long as the television is overloaded with aggression and sex, with no mentors in learning to love, as long as these obtain, or there will continue to be among young people such frightening depression and suicide. Our 20th century was originally heralded as the age which would be graced with rationalism, the age when enlightened education would be widespread, religion would at last be cleansed of all superstition, and would itself be enlightened. Indeed, almost all the fond aims of the Enlightenment have been at least partially realized. We've had great wealth for some people, freedom from tyranny as the goal for most people in the West, dissemination of science ad infinitum. But what has happened? As a people, we are more confused, lacking moral ideals, dreading the future, uncertain what to do to change things or how to rescue our own inner life. We are the best informed people on earth, Archibald MacLeish proclaims. We are deluged with facts. We have lost or are losing our human ability to feel them. We know with our heads by the facts, by the abstractions. We seem unable to know, as Shakespeare knew, who made King Lear cry out blinded to the Gloucestershire on the heath. You know how this world goes, and Gloucestershire answers, I know it feelingly. Language abandons myth only at the price of the loss of human warmth, color, intimate meaning, values, these things that gives personal meaning to life. For we understand each other by identifying with the subjective meaning of language of other persons, by experiencing what important words mean to them in their world. Without myth, we are like a race of brain-injured people unable to go beyond the word and hear the person who is speaking. There can be no stronger proof of the impoverishment of contemporary culture than the popular, though profoundly mistaken definition of myth as falsehood. So in a sense, we consider our patients to be in the midst of creating their own myth. To conclude the first chapter, May writes, every individual seeks, indeed must seek if he or she is to remain sane, to bring some order and coherence into the stream of sensations, emotions, and ideas entering his or her consciousness from within or without. Each of us is forced to do deliberately for oneself what in previous ages was done by family, custom, church, and state, namely, form the myths in terms of which we can make some sense of our experience. Being conscious of the fact that we are responsible for creating our own myth is what gives us a sense of coherence, motivation, and purpose. Some of my patients who appear to me to be blindly living according to no internal structure, or who are following no implicit or explicit path, and who are living every day as if it is a brand new day, with no link to what happened yesterday or what could happen tomorrow, are unaware of the whimsical and irresponsible myth that they're creating for themselves. One could argue that there is some wisdom in living life as the fool, but ultimately, these people tend to view the negative consequences of their lack of coherence as the unfortunate manifestations of the universe's inherent cruelty, which of course makes them the righteous, innocent victim. Jung wrote, "Hardly had I finished the manuscript when it struck me what it means to live with myth and what it means to live without one. The man who thinks he can live without a myth or outside it, like one uprooted, has no true link either to the past, nor with ancestral life which continues within him, or yet with contemporary human society. The plaything of his reason never grips his vitals." Jung's last sentence really carries a lot of psychological weight here. The plaything of his reason never grips his vitals. What he's saying is that reason alone, by which most of our enlightened thinkers operate, is not enough to drive most of us forward in life. There is hardly any vitality in reason. In fact, we tell people to be reasonable, which often means act like you have no emotion. Show no real enthusiasm or disdain. Do not disagree. Do not argue. Simply be reasonable and act as if this doesn't affect you and never will. There's no vitality in that. Reason alone will never be sufficient, and so it is our propensity for myth-making which is actually inspiring to us. Unfortunately, there are seemingly millions of us who have fallen victim to the idea that we do not need myths, religions, or philosophies of life to help guide us, propel us into the future, or give us some semblance of community or link with our ancestral past. We have been sanctimoniously cut off from our myths by history's reasonable thinkers, whose inspired ideas Nietzsche rightly and succinctly encapsulated in his famous quote, "God is dead and we have killed him." The problem is that we did not necessarily consent to this metaphorical amputation from our history and culture. If anyone knows this, who better than the immigrants to all the countries who are expected to leave their old ways behind and assume the traditions, customs, and values of their new home? I worked with a woman of Mexican descent who lamented the loss of her culture and feared her cultural and traditional expression in the midst of living in a predominantly white and Republican area of rural Michigan. Her fear for being targeted for her skin color was palpable, and what's worse is that, in our political climate, her fear was not delusional. ICE can show up and harass you even if you are a legal American citizen. People like her know all too well the experience of loneliness that comes from being separated from your roots, your ancestral life, and their myths. Rollo writes, "Loneliness is one expression of our rootlessness. Many people in our day, separated from tradition and often cast out by society, are alone with no myths to guide them, no unquestioned rights to welcome them into community, no sacraments to initiate them into the holy, and so there is rarely anything holy. The loneliness of mythlessness is the deepest and least assuageable of all. Unrelated to past, unconnected with future, we hang as if in midair. And hanging in midair is where myself and my patients find ourselves collaborating in psychotherapy. Like an hour suspended in time that lies outside of life, in a realm of contemplation, possibility, reflection, and solitude. In our everyday lives, we're almost forced to embody the manic Western value of never stop, never stopping, but the therapeutic hour gives us both a moment to breathe. But the real question is this Western myth of if you work hard, you can achieve anything you want, really a meaningful myth to live by? Certainly, to get ahead in our society and to make sure you make enough money to sustain yourself and your family, you almost have no other choice but to grind for it. But the grind itself is hardly ever what is truly meaningful. It may be necessary, but the continuous, laborious grind for economic and housing stability makes enjoying the journey, that callous and toxic phrase, rather difficult for most people. So, what can we do then to help find or create the myth that we live by? Well, by now it should be understood what not to do, and that is follow the whims of our mythless culture, or submit to the unfulfilling demands of our economic system as our only means of establishing our identity. The goal of psychotherapy, as Jung said long ago, is not to get the patient to be healthy enough to go back to work. Psychotherapy is supposed to be about finding, through deep self-exploration, that personal myth that takes us beyond mere earning and spending of contemporary life and propels us forward into the future, and it's what gives us the energy to fuel our creative drives and limitless potential. We'll talk more about this in a later episode on the practice of psychotherapy. Marie-Louise von Franz said it best when she said, "To what end does one liberate one's own country if afterward there is no meaningful goal in life, no goal for which it is worthwhile to be free? If a person no longer finds any meaning in life, it makes no difference whether they waste away under a communist or capitalist regime. Only if they can use their freedom to create something meaningful is it relevant that they should be free. That is why finding the inner meaning of life is more important to the individual than anything else, and why the process of individuation must be given priority." She also makes a point, along with many others, that if society has become neurotic, is social adaptation still recommendable, or should the individual find the courage to resist it alone? All of this goes to show that following along the path of our mythless, manic, and pathologically extroverted society is at odds with the cultivation of a healthy psychological life. Finding a balance between meeting our economic needs and creating our own self-sustaining myth is part of the answer to the question of life. Indeed, in a functional and healthy society, our economic grind should inherently support the advancement of our own personal myth, and we should not be forced to choose one over another. But in terms of psychotherapy, our patients' inner lives matter more than their outer circumstances. That is not to say that their outer circumstances are of no concern, or should not have a role in their overall treatment, but in terms of what is humanly possible, there have been plenty of examples throughout history of people who have little material possessions and are completely satisfied, and those who have everything and are still on the verge of suicide. The common questions are how and why, when maybe the most important question of all should be, what myth did they live by? Rollo May writes, "I wince to think of how much time has been wasted by intelligent men and women arguing about whether psychotherapy cures and trying to fit psychotherapy into the mode of Western 19th century medicine. Our task is to be guide, friend, and interpreter to persons on their journeys through their private hells and purgatories. Specifically, our task is to help patients get to the point where they can decide whether they wish to remain victims, for to be a victim has its real benefits, or whether they choose to leave this victim state and venture through purgatory with the hope of achieving some sense of paradise. In America, we seem, by our practice, to act on the wish that we could pass over the despair of mortification and know only the exaltation of ascent. We seem to believe that we can be reborn without ever dying. Such is the spiritual version of the American dream." That concludes this week's episode of So, You Want to Learn Psychology? I hope you enjoyed. Tune in next week for another episode, and comment down below if you have any recommendations or favorite books on psychology, philosophy, mental health, or anything else that could be related to the cultivation of your own personal myth. I appreciate the support. Until next time, thank you.